CBS Young and the Restless spoilers. The days following New Year's Eve unfolded with an intoxicating sense of renewal for Daniel and Tessa, who had allowed themselves, perhaps too willingly, to drift into the warm haze of a love that felt fragile and unexpected, yet soothing in ways both of them desperately needed. With Mariah gone, and the emptiness she left behind still lingering like a quiet echo through the corners of their lives, they clung to each other as if their connection might fill the void, or at least soften the sharp edges of grief and uncertainty. Every moment between them seemed to move with a strange lightness, a reprieve from the heaviness that had shaped so much of their recent past. Together, they rebuilt small pieces of joy, moments of laughter, tenderness, and shared vulnerability that felt almost miraculous after months of loss and emotional disarray. Daniel, in particular, welcomed this unexpected affection as though it were a lifeline thrown to him in the middle of a storm. He had spent so long drifting through guilt, loneliness, and confusion that the sudden presence of someone who saw him not as a collection of past failures, but as a man capable of feeling alive again felt both dangerous and irresistible. Tessa's gentleness soothed parts of him that had long been bruised, and for a brief window of time, he allowed himself to believe that happiness, quiet, steady happiness was still possible. But Genoa City had always been a place where peace was temporary, where the past was never truly buried, and where fate had a habit of reshuffling lives just when people believed they were finally finding their footing. That truth arrived in the form of a woman whose presence alone shattered the fragile optimism Daniel had begun to build. The moment she stepped into town, whispers followed like ripples in upon whispers of familiarity, of disbelief, of fear. When Daniel finally saw her, his world cracked open so violently he felt unable to breathe. Standing before him was Heather Stevens, alive, whole, and carrying an expression that mirrored the same shock and devastation he felt. She was not a ghost, not a memory resurrected by grief or guilt, but a living, breathing reality that unraveled everything he thought he had put to rest. The sight of Heather struck him like a physical blow, pulling him backward through time with merciless force. Every moment of mourning he had endured, every sleepless night spent agonizing over her loss, every tear shed for the life they would never finish building suddenly rendered meaningless by the impossible truth standing right in front of him. His knees felt weak, his pulse hammered in his ears, and a cold wave of panic swept through him. It wasn't simply that Heather had returned. It was that her existence obliterated the emotional reboot he had forced himself to attempt, sending him spiraling into a place where guilt, love, confusion, anger, and disbelief collided violently without order or logic. Seeing her alive felt like witnessing the collapse of the world he had constructed to survive her death. The effect on his relationship with Tessa was immediate and catastrophic. Their connection, still young and trembling in its infancy, could not withstand the magnitude of this revelation. Heather's presence cast a long, dark shadow over every moment Daniel and Tessa had shared, not because their feelings were insincere, but because the reappearance of the woman he had loved and lost introduced a storm of emotional conflict neither of them could possibly navigate. Tessa felt herself shrinking beneath the weight of Heather's return, questioning whether she had unknowingly stepped into a space that did not belong to her, whether she had given her heart to a man who was never truly free to love her. The tenderness she and Daniel had nurtured suddenly felt exposed, fragile, and possibly doomed, though she could not bring herself to voice such fears. Instead, she watched as Daniel unraveled, torn between two realities that could not coexist, each demanding something from him that he no longer knew how to give. Daniel's panic morphed into anger at Heather, not at Tessa, but at the cruel absurdity of the universe that had forced him to grieve a woman who had not truly died, only to resurrect her at the very moment he had begun to rediscover hope. His mind spun in frantic circles, trying to reconcile the past he thought was dead with the present he had only just begun to trust. The emotional devastation was so total that he found himself lashing inward, punishing himself for ever allowing another woman into his heart, punishing himself for failing to somehow know that Heather had still been alive, punishing himself for daring to move forward. The guilt that had once faded into a manageable ache now roared back with full force, sharper and more punishing than ever. Every breath felt weighted with betrayal of Heather, betrayal of Tessa, betrayal of himself. Heather's explanation only deepened the emotional labyrinth he was trapped in. Her voice did not bring comfort, it brought terror. She recounted being kidnapped by Y&R and Jordan, trapped in a nightmare that twisted her life into a secret kept from the world. A woman who resembled her replacement had died in her place, leading everyone to believe she had perished. The truth behind her disappearance unraveled like a grotesque revelation, filled with shadows, manipulation, and the kind of cruelty that left permanent scars. As Daniel listened, his stomach twisted. Her suffering, her survival, the horror of the lies told in her name all demanded empathy, demanded love, demanded the version of him that had once been devoted to her. Yet at the same time, it thrust him into an impossible emotional conflict, forcing him to confront the reality that he had loved someone else in her absence. The news spread quickly, igniting old wounds and raising new questions that rippled across Genoa City. Sharon, already tied to the darker elements of Y&R's legacy, found herself drawn into the investigation surrounding Heather's supposed death and miraculous return. Certain inconsistencies in the records, whispers of people seen near the time of her disappearance, and long-buried secrets resurfaced, threatening to expose past actions that several residents hoped would remain buried forever. The revelation of the decoy who had died in Heather's stead became a grim riddle, sparking suspicion and paranoia. Had her death been part of a larger conspiracy? Who else knew the truth? And why had Y&R gone to such lengths to orchestrate such a deception? The entire ordeal cast a chilling light on the manipulations and crimes lurking beneath Genoa City's polished surface. As the questions multiplied, the emotional fallout continued consuming the lives closest to Heather, especially Daniel and Tessa. Tessa, who had believed she had finally found someone who understood the aching loneliness she carried in Mariah's absence, now found herself confronting the terrifying possibility that Daniel no longer belonged to her, that his heart had been reclaimed by a woman who had every right to claim it. She felt a familiar aching echo of past insecurities, past heartbreak scraping up her spine, whispering that perhaps she had allowed herself to hope too soon. She had stepped into a space carved out by grief and longing, not realizing that the ghost she thought she was helping Daniel move past was still alive, still tethered to him by a history far deeper and more entrenched than anything she could offer. Each time she looked at him, she saw the conflict in his eyes, the part of him that yearned toward Heather even as another part remained entangled with her. Mariah's potential return added a new layer of complexity. If she were to walk back into Genoa City and find Tessa struggling to hold together the remnants of a relationship that had been undone by a woman's resurrection, she would face not just jealousy or anger, but a version of Daniel altered by trauma, guilt, and romantic conflict. The dynamic between the three of the Mariah, Tessa, and Daniel would inevitably shift into something no one could predict. Mariah might blame Daniel for taking advantage of Tessa's vulnerability, or she might blame Tessa for moving on in her absence. Or perhaps she would see the truth more clearly than anyone else, that Daniel was unraveling under pressures no one should ever be expected to endure, and that none of them could move forward until he confronted the emotional wreckage that Heather's return had created. But the most devastating burden fell on Daniel himself. He stood at a crossroads that felt more like a fracture point, forced to choose not between two women, but between two versions of himself shaped by the love he had shared with Heather, the history and memories that defined so much of his adult life. The other shaped by the fragile but genuine connection he had begun to build with Tessa, a connection born from pain, healing, and the terrifying hope that he could find happiness again. Both women carried pieces of his heart, but neither choice offered a path free of suffering. If he returned to Heather, he feared he would be acting out of obligation rather than pure love, that he would chain himself to guilt instead of joy. Yet if he stayed with Tessa, he feared he would be abandoning a woman who had endured unspeakable trauma, a woman who had fought to stay alive long enough to return to him, a woman whose heart still beat in sync with the one he used to be. The chaos surrounding Heather's return forced him to confront the darkest, most painful parts of himself. He felt ripped open, exposed, judged by the universe itself. The anger he felt toward fate, toward the timing, the cruelty, the surreal unfairness of it all festered in him like a wound that refused to close. He wanted to scream, to disappear, to tear down every emotional structure he had built because they all felt like lies now. He loved Tessa. He loved Heather. And he hated himself for both truths. Every waking moment became a battlefield of conflicting emotions. He dreaded looking into Tessa's eyes because he knew she could see the turmoil tearing him apart. He dreaded facing Heather because every glimpse of her reminded him of the life he thought he had lost, the version of himself he thought had died with her. The guilt that consumed him was suffocating, a relentless weight that made it impossible to breathe without feeling like he was betraying someone. There was no path that allowed him to keep both women, no path that allowed him to walk away unscarred. Whatever decision he made would leave emotional wreckage behind, shattered trust, broken hearts, and the irreversible loss of a relationship that once held promise. Love had become a curse rather than a blessing, a relentless force pulling him in two directions, demanding a sacrifice he was not ready to make. And as Genoa City buzzed with speculation, as Heather's story unfolded, as Sharon probed deeper into the conspiracy, as Tessa fought to hold herself together, and as the shadow of Mariah's possible return loomed larger, Daniel realized that he was not choosing between past and present. He was choosing the shape of the future and which version of himself he was willing to destroy in order to survive it. The morning that was supposed to define a new beginning for Daniel and Tessa unfolded with a soft, golden stillness that made the future feel almost gentle, as though the world itself had paused long enough to allow them a moment of pure happiness before the inevitable chaos of life resumed. They had woken wrapped in one another's warmth, speaking in quiet promises and tender affirmations, imagining a path forward smooth enough to heal the fractures of their pasts. For Daniel, it was the first time in months he had felt that the world might finally be returning to color after being muted by grief and confusion. For Tessa, it was a fragile but intoxicating hope, a sense that perhaps destiny was finally offering her a space to belong again after so much loss, especially with the ghost of Mariah still haunting the edges of her heart. They moved through that morning as though it belonged solely to them, as though the future they whispered about was already unfolding simply because they believed in it. Neither realized how swiftly and violently those soft edges would be ripped apart. When Heather appeared in Genoa City, unbroken and standing in the flesh, moment did not feel real. Her return struck like a thunderclap, splitting open the fragile peace Daniel and Tessa had been creating. 1 second they were holding onto each other with the ease of two people stepping into a shared future. The next, the air around them trembled like glass on the verge of shattering. Tessa felt it first, not in the words spoken, not in the explanation Heather had yet to give, but in the way Daniel's body tensed beside her, the way his breath caught in his throat, the way the ground seemed to fall out beneath him as he stared at the woman he once believed he lost forever. That reaction, alone, instinctive, laced with shock and unresolved grief, sent a piercing ache through Tessa's chest. She knew instantly that something sacred had been disturbed, that the life she imagined with Daniel was no longer anchored the way she believed it had been. The universe had shifted beneath them, and she felt herself slipping. The happiness of their morning together evaporated instantly, as though it had been a dream too delicate to withstand reality. The promises Daniel had made soft, heartfelt, full of a sincerity she never once questioned, now hung in the air like echoes of something suddenly distant. They no longer felt like assurances, but like fragile illusions that had crumbled the moment Heather stepped back into existence. For Tessa, the betrayal was not rooted in action, but in emotion. She knew Daniel had not willed this to happen. She knew he had not lied to her. Yet the pain twisted through her anyway, sharp and unrelenting, because she could see the conflict rising inside him with every breath he struggled to take. It was in his eyes, war between past and present, between love lost and love found, between grief and hope. She saw the man she cared for drowning in memories, drowning in guilt, drowning in the resurgence of feelings he had not had the chance to resolve. And in that drowning, she saw herself becoming the afterthought, the collateral damage, the temporary comfort his heart might now discard. She felt stripped bare by the realization that her place in Daniel's life was no longer secure, not because he wanted to hurt her, but because fate had rewritten the rules in an instant. Her mind raced through the moments they had shared, the warmth of his hands, the way he looked at her that morning, the way hope had flickered in his voice. All of it now felt tainted, overshadowed, swallowed by the ghost of a woman who was no longer a ghost. In her chest, the old fear she thought she had buried long ago, fear of being left behind, replaced, forgotten, rose with a suffocating intensity. It was a familiar terror carved from years of instability and heartbreak. And now it was back, stronger than ever, whispering that she had let herself believe too deeply in a future that was never truly guaranteed. Unable to bear the quiet panic building within her, Tessa forced herself to confront the question tearing through her: where did she stand now? She needed clarity, not out of anger, but out of self-preservation, out of the desperate need to understand whether she was still part of Daniel's life or whether she had already become a shadow fading into the background. So she turned to him, demanding not with cruelty, but with troubling resolve, a truth she feared would break her. She needed to know what their relationship meant in the face of Heather's return. She needed to know whether the love they had barely begun to build could survive the resurrection of a past Daniel had never truly laid to rest. Daniel, caught in an impossible emotional storm, could barely form coherent thoughts, let alone a coherent answer. Everything inside him had twisted into knot shock, love, guilt, devastation, longing, fear. He loved Tessa. He had grown to rely on the gentleness she brought into his life, the way she steadied him when he felt himself fracturing. She had been a balm, a safe place, someone who helped him believe in joy again. But Heather was history, was memory, was a life he had once built dreams around. She had been love, loss, family, future. She had been the woman he had mourned, the ghost that had shaped so many of his choices, the person whose absence had carved a hollow inside him that no amount of pretending could fill. Now she stood breathing in front of him, a living contradiction, and he found himself torn between two worlds he did not know how to reconcile. Tessa watched him struggle, watched him search for words that would not come, and each second of silence tightened the ache in her chest. She knew, deep down, that he wasn't choosing silence out of indifference but out of paralysis. But the effect was the same. The woman she feared she could never compete with had returned, and suddenly her love, her presence seemed so small. The fear of abandonment, the fear of being the second choice, or the temporary comfort devoured her. She tried to steady herself, tried to remind her heart that Daniel was not a man who betrayed intentionally, but she could not stop the spiraling dread consuming her. Daniel, meanwhile, felt suffocated by the weight of the decision suddenly thrust upon him. He had never imagined a world where he would have to choose between the woman who had been his past and the woman who had become his present. He could not imagine hurting Heather, not after what she endured, not after believing he failed her by letting go too soon. But he also could not imagine hurting Tessa, the woman who had been the first flicker of light in the long darkness following Heather's death. The pressure clawed at him, leaving him breathless, unable to escape the truth that no matter what he decided, he would tear someone apart. He would be the villain in someone's story. He would lose part of himself either way. The more the reality settled in, the more the foundations of his world splintered. The happiness of the morning felt like a cruel joke now, a reminder of how quickly life could flip from bliss to torment. He felt himself sinking beneath the weight of responsibility just to himself, but to both women, to the memories they shared with him, to the futures they each expected from him. His hands trembled. His thoughts fractured. The walls seemed to close in around him. Tessa saw all of this reflected in the conflicted sorrow on Daniel's face, and her fear intensified. She could not compete with a miracle. She could not compete with the raw emotional gravity of a return from the dead. She felt herself shrinking, fighting the urge to pull away before she was pushed. The ick inside her grew into something sharp, something dangerous. She had promised herself she would never again let love break her the way it had before. Yet here she was, on the verge of losing everything she had only just begun to trust. And so, the two of them stood suspended in a painful limbo, Daniel paralyzed by a choice he could not make, Tessa suffocated by a fear she could not silence. Every second stretched into something unbearable, a widening gulf neither of them knew how to cross. No words were enough. No reassurance could erase the reality that Heather's return had fundamentally altered their lives. Daniel finally understood that he could not protect both of them from pain. He could not stand in the middle forever. A decision was coming, whether he wanted it or not, and whichever path he chose would fracture something sacred. The pressure of that truth settled like a stone in his chest. Even hope felt heavy now, twisted into something uncertain and fragile. Tessa, feeling the distance growing between them, clung desperately to the last pieces of the morning they had shared, but even those memories now felt tainted by the storm that had consumed them. She saw her future slipping away, saw herself once again standing alone, abandoned by circumstances beyond her control. And yet she could not stop wanting him, could not stop hoping he would choose her, even as she tried to brace herself for the heartbreak she feared was coming. Daniel's silence became its own uncertain choice, but the clearest sign of his turmoil. And in that silence, both of them felt the future collapse into uncertainty. By the end of that day, the joy that had blossomed between them had withered into a brittle, trembling fracture. Daniel could not move forward. Tessa could not hold on. And the decision impossible, inevitable hung over them like a storm cloud waiting to break, leaving their fate suspended in a delicate, painful balance neither knew how to escape.